In 1945, the world was still stuck in the middle of World War II, and things looked pretty bad. But on May 8th, everyone in Europe started celebrating because Germany had given up. This was a big deal, but the war in the Pacific was still going on, and no one knew when it would end. The Pacific was a whole different story compared to Europe. The ocean was huge, and there were lots of islands that were important to fighting. The Allies had just finished fighting in Europe, and now they had to focus on Japan, which was determined to keep fighting. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were really tough, and the Japanese fought really hard. These battles were a sign that the war in the Pacific was going to be long and hard. Despite the celebrations of VE Day, there was a palpable sense of unfinished business among the Allied nations. The joy of victory in Europe was muted by the realization that a formidable challenge still lay ahead in the Pacific. The Allied military forces, under the leadership of the United States, were drawing a noose around the Japan home islands, preparing for an invasion that many feared would result in unprecedented bloodshed. Japan was under a lot of pressure. The Allied bombing had destroyed things, and the blockade made it hard to get food and supplies. But the Japanese army didn't give up because they thought surrender was shameful. The Allied leaders had a hard decision to make. They could try to invade Japan, but that would be dangerous. Or they could use a new weapon called the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was very powerful, and people weren't sure if it was right to use it. As the world celebrated the end of hostilities in Europe in May of 1945, the Pacific theater of World War II remained a cauldron of intense conflict and brutal warfare. The Allied forces, primarily led by the United States, continued their strategic push towards Japan, aiming to end the war through either forced surrender or total military defeat of the Japanese forces. The Pacific Campaign was characterized by a series of amphibious assaults on strategically significant islands, each of which was fiercely contested by the Japanese defenders. The battles of Iwo Jima from February to March of 1945 and Okinawa from April to June of 1945 were among the bloodiest of these confrontations. These battles showcased the Japanese military's willingness to fight to the last man to defend their homeland, highlighting the challenges the Allies faced in securing a victory without astronomical loss of life. Iwo Jima, a small island strategically located between the Mariana Islands and Japan, was deemed essential for the Allies as a base for fighter aircraft to escort bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. The battle for Iwo Jima was marked by intense and bloody fighting, with the iconic image of U.S. Marines raising the flag on Mount Surabaki becoming a symbol of the Allied struggle and eventual victory in the Pacific. The battle for Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, was even more significant and deadly. Okinawa was seen as the final stepping stone for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The battle lasted for nearly 3 months, with a tremendous loss of life on both sides. The Japanese employed kamikaze tactics extensively, causing severe casualties and damage to the Allied naval forces. These battles underscored the formidable challenge of forcing Japan's surrender. The Japanese military's doctrine of no surrender in the anticipation of a protracted and bloody invasion of Japan's home islands weighed heavily on the Allied leadership. The potential for massive casualties among Allied forces and Japanese civilians alike led to the consideration of alternative means to compel Japan to surrender. The final phase of the Pacific War saw a dramatic escalation in attempts to force Japan's surrender. 2 pivotal actions stood out during this period: the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan. These events significantly influenced Japan's decision to surrender, marking a turning point in World War II. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a city in western Japan. This bombing marked the first ever use of a nuclear weapon in warfare, resulting in the immediate deaths of an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, with total deaths by the end of the year estimated to be as high as 140,000 due to injuries and radiation sickness. The devastation was unprecedented, and the impact on the city and its inhabitants was catastrophic. Despite the destruction of Hiroshima, the Japanese government did not immediately surrender. It was only after a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August the 9th, killing an estimated 40 to 70,000 people, and after the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August the 8th, that the Japanese leadership began to seriously consider surrender. The Soviet declaration of war was a significant blow to Japan, which had hoped to use the Soviet Union as a mediator for more favorable surrender terms. Instead, the Soviets launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held territories in Manchuria, further diminishing Japan's capacity to continue the war. The combination of the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan created a situation where continued resistance was futile. The Japanese leadership, faced with the prospect of additional atomic bombings and a Soviet invasion of the home islands, recognized that surrender was the only option to prevent further unimaginable destruction and loss of life. These events underscored the brutal reality of the war and the lengths to which the Allies were prepared to go to ensure Japan's surrender. The decision to use atomic weapons remains one of the most controversial aspects of World War II, debated for its ethical implications, its necessity, and its impact on hastening the end of the war and saving lives that would have been lost in a protracted invasion of Japan. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the Soviet declaration of war, were decisive in bringing about Japan's surrender. These actions highlighted the destructive power of nuclear weapons and set the stage for the post-war world order, ushering in the nuclear age and significantly altering global geopolitics. The culmination of the Pacific War was marked by Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms of surrender, following the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war. These monumental events led to Emperor Hirohito's historic decision to intervene directly, a move that was unprecedented in the Japanese political system, where the emperor traditionally remained a symbolic figure rather than an active policymaker. In the days following the bombings and the Soviet declaration, the Japanese government found itself in a state of turmoil. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, also known as the Big Six, was deeply divided over the decision to surrender. While some members advocated for continuing the fight, hoping for a more favorable negotiation or even a miraculous turn of events, the reality of Japan's situation, facing complete destruction and the possibility of a Soviet invasion of the home islands, made such hopes increasingly untenable. The turning point came on August the 14th of 1945, when Emperor Hirohito made an unprecedented intervention. Recognizing the futility of further resistance and the catastrophic consequences of continued combat, he ordered the government to accept the terms laid out in the Potsdam Declaration, which called for Japan's unconditional surrender. This decision was not reached easily. It was met with resistance from hardline military factions, leading to an attempted coup d'etat, which ultimately failed. In his address to the nation on August the 15th, known as the Jewel Voice broadcast, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to the Japanese people, marking the first time many had heard their sovereign's voice. Using formal and somewhat obscure language, he cited the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb and the Soviet entry into the war as the reasons for surrender, stating that continuing the war would only lead to the total extinction of the human civilization. The use of an atomic bomb is still a topic of debate today. Some people believe that it was necessary to end the war, while others believe it was simply too cruel. Well, what do you guys think? Do let us know in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more videos like this.